Welcome to today's Clinical Trials Toolkit series. Um, the title is Research Data Protection Process in the Office of Sponsored Programs, Clinical Trial Agreement, Review, and Negotiation. Our presenters today are Rosemary Castile. She's with WVU Research, the WVU Research Director, Research Systems and Operational Data Service, and Molly Superfesky, who is the Assistant Director of the Office of Sponsored Programs Award Negotiations. So I'm going to give you a short bio on Rosemary and then Molly. Again, as you're listening to me, if you would go ahead and put your name and email address in the chat and indicate if you would like CEs, that would be great. So Rosemary, a little bit about her. She is information technology professional with deep experience in IT service, project management, and information security audit. She has worked for NASDAQ, the University of Arizona, the University of Nevada, Reno, and WVU twice. She left in 2012, but returned in 2019. And when she returned, she was a part of the Office of Human Research Protections. While in OHRP, she worked on the AAHRPP accreditation, developed the new website, the Office of Automation, including a remote work environment. She formed the workflow automation, developed an SOP infrastructure, led the project for the new IRB protocol system, developed the first electronic informed consent capability, and started the data protection process. In July of 2022, she assumed the responsibility for research systems and operational research data, and she currently reports to Dr. Fred King. A fun fact about her, she enjoys spending time with her family, reading, landscape gardening, and refinishing furniture. So Molly, her part of the presentation will be the Office of Sponsored Programs, Clinical Trial Agreement, and Review and Negotiation. A little bit about her. She's a West Virginia native who was lucky enough to live in a couple of different places around the country as a child. So she has firsthand knowledge that West Virginia is truly a great place to live. She has negotiated clinical trial agreements at the Office of Sponsored Programs since 2004, and she's worked for WVU for 22 years. A surprising fact about her is that she's an aspiring dog handler. Her dog Archie and her train every weekend, and they compete for titles, which is awesome. Before we get started and I hand it over to Rosemary, both presenters have said that if you have questions while they're presenting, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll be watching the chat, so I'll let them know that they have questions. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rosemary and we can get started.
Thank you, Debbie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the intro, so I don't have to do that. That was very nice. Okay, so I'm just going to skip to the next slide. The topics that I'm going to present are, I'm going to start with my new position and another new position in the research office, because I think that you all should be aware of them and what the responsibilities are, just to be clear. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on that. What operational research data service means, that is part of my role. The data protection process overview, some upcoming changes, and things, available resources for y'all to find out more about things I've talked about. So the two new positions, I don't know if you're all aware that Katie Storrs came back to the university. She left for a few years and worked at Emory. She reports to Dr. Fred King, and her title is AVP for Strategy and Research. So you can, read about what her role is, but she and I work hand in hand on the strategic plan for the research office, her more so on the operational side with the departments, and me more so on the technology side and focused on the research community. So you can see a little bit about what she does. Now, for me, my new role that I took over in July as a result of Alan Martin leaving, and it's part of what he did was oversight of the research IT group, which reports into Bryce Knotts at WVU ITS. But then it expanded. I brought data protection with me. So that is the operational research data service. And then research systems are the systems that, we all use to administer and administer research. So approve, and ensure compliance. So the systems, the KC systems and other systems that go with that. So I do champion the research technology strategic plan, which we have the very first one this year that we're working on, and also working through governance structures and oversight structures to get that strategic plan approved, to get input to it. And I also monitor the continuous improvement of processes that I'm responsible for. And the big one right now is data protection. So just a little bit about operational research data service. We tend to make the differentiation here because when we talk about research data, it means different things to different people. For instance, in the WVU side, for them, it's institutional data that they use for benchmarking. So that is the data that comes out of the administration and compliance system, the WVU KC system. The data that I have oversight responsibility for is the data that's created by the researchers and the data that they use and create. So, I'm not responsible for data repositories and data sets, but once the PI goes through the data protection process and says, I'm going to use this data and I'm going to create my results or whatever the goal is, that's the data that I have oversight for, ensuring that it's compliant and not just with regulatory stuff outside, but with institutional policy. And then strategy for IT service. So we're trying to focus a lot on the research community. What do the researchers need to do research? What type of storage do you need? It should be seamless. It should be easy to access. It should be compliant. So, we're trying to plan for the future to determine what those things are. And of course, we will not do it in a vacuum. We will do it with groups that are in place and other new groups that will be created, like the IT governance groups. And if you all have questions about that kind of stuff, we can, you can ask me offline or send me an email or whatever, because it's a new responsibility and this is probably the first time it's being communicated to this type of a group. So the life cycle of research data management is this. I found this and kind of reused it. So this is kind of what we're trying to do through data protection. We're trying to get things backed up before the protocol is submitted so that people are aware of what the requirements are. So it used to be that you would submit the protocol and then you'd get stopped several times throughout the submission to ask about, why are you using this? Is this compliant? Why are you putting your data here? What product are you using? Do you have an agreement? And if you have international components, then you've got to go over to, export control. If you are paying your participant, are you using the right system? No one ever at one point in time kind of knew what all was approved at one point in time. So part of data protection was to get all of that in one place, documented, so that the people reviewing will know what's approved and what isn't, and to take that responsibility off of the IRB reviewer, because they don't know what IT requires for data security. Only IT knows that. So the goal was, let's back it up, let everybody know what approvals they need, and then once they get their storage approved, they can submit the protocol. The other approvals for an agreement or software or participant payment systems that aren't standard would come outside of the data protection system, but the thought was that the PI would at least know they have to do that. And of course, the research can't begin until all of those approvals are done. The data protection process does not track those approvals. We leave that up to the researcher. We just try to notify and educate that these things may be required based on the answers you provide on the form. So these are some of the things that I'm will try to do or am doing. So ensuring repeatable automated process for all aspects of data compliance and oversight. So that's taking, automating where possible, like data protection, making sure we have the right roles so that if somebody leaves the university, all the knowledge doesn't go out with them, that we can pick up and continue on even after they leave. Manage the process, ensure the system is compliant with the institution and regulations. I monitor requests to ensure they're moving through the process in a timely manner. I know sometimes this is a problem, but we have about 900 requests that have come through submissions since October. And at any given time, there's usually about 20 to 25 that are sitting there because they've got something more complex that has to be approved, or there's some question about it. So for the most part, a lot of them are auto approved. It's just tracking and like a registration that this is what I'm doing. And it says, this is, as you know, the form will say you've got high risk data, low risk data, and you'll either get an auto certificate or you'll have to go through some sort of an approval. And most of the time it works very well. There are exceptions though. I lead the development of that process, and I work with about 5 other departments on the form to make sure that their information is captured the way they want to and that they're notified how they want to be notified. I do manage the strategic plan. I collaborate along with others with the hospital to make sure the requirements related to their data are met. That's not my primary responsibility, but part of the process helps to make sure that happens. And, just collaborating with everybody else, because I'm only one person and what I do, I can't do in a vacuum. I have to do with input from everybody. As you know, it was required as of October with the goal of developing a mature, repeatable process for ensuring compliance. The focus of it is really not to cause everybody a problem and to review everybody's projects and studies. It's really to make sure that we're focusing our resources on the high-risk situations, the high-risk projects, the high-risk data. The primary benefits are transparency and unified terminology. As you know, we all we talk about different things. People call a protocol an IRB. Data protection is used loosely, and sometimes it means privacy, sometimes it means data security, sometimes it means confidentiality. So, we're trying to come to a common set of terms so that when we talk and educate and consult and answer questions, that we're all kind of on the same page. We came up with a classification. It's not any rocket science thing, but high, medium, and low, based on university classifications and other classifications that we had to come up with that didn't exist, like a research PII, and anonymous and de-identified. You're familiar with all of that. The second benefit would be clear direction related to the next steps. So we try to give people, based on the answers, this is what you need to do next. You need a HIPAA waiver, you need to put an iLab request in for CTSI, you need to contact HSCITS. So that was, out of the gates. I know we can improve on that, but that was a goal, to give people sort of one-stop shopping. This is, who you're going to hear from. You said you were going to share data or transfer data. OSP is going to contact you, when they get to you in the queue. Hopefully for most people, and it seems like it is working, decrease time for approvals. Because again, we're backing it up. I know there's some that has not probably been the case, but those have been few and far between. Some of the things that were impacts as a result of the implementation: we removed questions from the protocol. However, the HIPAA privacy questions, which may seem redundant, are still there because of, HIPAA is a privacy law, so we do have to keep that in the protocol. And the questions in data protection are really about confidentiality and storage rather than privacy. But the two kind of go hand in hand. But again, there was a reason why we left them in the protocol. It is the first step in human subjects research. It is required, as you know, to be attached. And these are the other departments that are involved or could get a notice, depending on the questions that are answered. OSP, export control, participant payment, CTSI, and the ITS groups. In my opinion, and I know a lot of others, hopefully you all feel this way, that before data protection, this is kind of the way things were. And I experienced this firsthand when I was in OHARP, because it was just a daily thing, especially with Joe Malcolm, and I'm sure many of you know him. And Molly, I know, has had some of that back and forth going on. So after data protection, we should have a more streamlined process that's clear. Again, it's not perfect. We're still continuously improving it and ironing out roles and educating and, all that fun stuff. But if you know anything about process improvement, which I have done for 20 years, if you have a maturity scale from 0 to 5, which 0 is complete chaos, this process was probably like in the negative whatever, and we took it to at least a 3.5. So, and I think that was a huge jump. And whenever you take something through a huge jump like that, there are impacts, and people feel pain because they didn't have to do it before. Other people just don't understand what some of the stuff means. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of resources to do education in the research community. I did some town halls. I haven't done anything since those town halls last fall. But we are planning education, because I think it's important to have those, whether they're videos, of course there's guidance on the webpage, but formal education about data classifications and PHI. I mean, a lot of people just still don't understand the terms. They don't understand if they're in a covered entity. What does that mean? How do I find out? So I don't necessarily think this audience has those issues, but it is an issue out in the other areas. So these are the data sources that you see on the form. And a lot of the logic of the form right now, the way it's built, is built off of what you select here. So you get more questions and your data is classified based on these selections. And so what do we use this certificate for? Of course, and this was my original presentation, so a lot of you've been through it and you know this. So you attach it to the protocol. If you had a protocol that was approved before October 11th, you're not required to have a data protection certificate. It provides you with a record of the data requested and the approvals needed. So it's sort of like it's a certificate. You should keep it with your project or study records, so that you have it for reflection in case anything changes in the data you're using or your storage. OSP may ask for it for data agreement requests. And it is the source. The certificate is not the source, but the form is the source for the research personnel, because as you know, flex and exempt protocols and NHSR cannot be amended. So if you're using PHI and the personnel changes, the source is the data protection certificate, and that's why we ask you to put the personnel on there. So this is just going to go through the 3 different levels of risks of data and how long it takes to get a certificate, which was a huge question way back in October. How long does it take to get it? So if you've got low risk data, so anonymous, fully de-identified, or data from public sources, as soon as you press submit, you're going to get your certificate auto approved within 15 minutes. It's going to tell you, it's going to repeat what you saw on the screen before submission about where you can store that data. And you should keep that again with your records and submit it. And just a reminder, a common problem that people had in the beginning, it's not so much anymore, is that a limited data set is identifiable PHI. It's not de-identified because there are HIPAA identifiers in the LDS. At least this is the way the university treats it. Medium risk data is the same thing. It's confidential according to the university. It does not have any sensitive data, PHI or otherwise. This would be your identifiable data research, what we call research PII. So it's for a good example right now, because we're still sort of struggling with this definition in the covered entity. And the non-covered entity, if they collect email and birthday or email is an identifier, and that would be considered research PII and be confidential. If you're in a covered entity, depends on what you're doing. And again, we're working through this definition right now. It could either be PHI or it could be research PII. It's the HIPAA compliance part that we're trying to iron out right now with this definition. So that's what the little red thing is there. So note that we're working on it. And again, for this group, I'm not sure that that's an issue. High risk data, if you're on the WVU side and there's no PHI, but it's considered sensitive, like it's got a social security number, driver's license number, anything like that, you're still going to get the certificate within 15 minutes. If you indicated on the form, you could use the approved storage. On the health sciences side, the covered entity side, it's going to take 5 to 7 business days. Again, some of these are just more complex to review. It may be less than 5 days, but for now, we combine the CTSI privacy review for medical records if you're using them, and the HSC ITS storage review together. So it used to be separate, so each one would take 3 days or so, but now they're together. So it's usually 5 to 7 business days, unless there's some, somebody's on vacation and they can't get to it, or there's a more complex issue that we have to resolve. And just a reminder that the medical record number is a HIPAA identifier. So if you get a certificate, does that mean you can begin research? Go ahead.
Interrupt. Someone in the room had a question. I was gonna go ahead and put her on the mic so everybody could hear her, okay?
Okay.
Hi, Rosemary. Can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. Could you just give me an example of a case of no PHI, but still high risk? Because I'm trying to conceptualize that.
Well, it's right now, it would be if you're in a covered entity and you're doing a survey and you're asking people about medical conditions, anything that could be misconstrued as medical information, even though it may not be going into the medical record, is right now the gray area where the majority of the time it's considered PHI.
Thank you.
And so we're trying to work through, we can store it as high risk data. That's not a problem. The problem is, is HIPAA compliance needed? Waivers, signatures for informed consent, and even down onto, Molly's area and agreements, that's impacted. So we're working, it's been an issue that we've been talking about for over a year, and it's kind of been raised just most recently in the past week. And there's other people on the call that I've been talking with about it. So it is something that we need to clarify as an institution and provide more guidance to, because it's expensive to store stuff as HIPAA data for a lot of reasons. And, it's expensive to comply with HIPAA because it takes people to review it. You all have to jump through more hoops. So that would be something that you'll hear more about here, hopefully soon. Is that good? Okay. So no other approvals are needed. If you don't need, if you're not waiting for export control to say anything about international, I think we've had 3 people who have sent notice to export control because they might have been using a lab in another country or something like that. So if you're still waiting to hear back, you can't start your research until you hear back from them. If you're waiting for a data agreement, you can't start your research till the data agreement's done. But if you need nothing else, it's pretty straightforward. You're doing a chart review, you're storing it on an HSC managed server, you're not sharing it. That's all you need, you're done. You can start. You can even, with the protocol being approved, you can start. Oh, okay. So the one thing I want to point out is the goal of this data protection certificate is to represent the approval for storage. transfer and share mechanisms and products. So all of that you answer, ITS will look at it. And then when it gets to OSP and they look at it for the agreement, they may have questions about that and they may contact ITS, which may cause more questions to be asked about things that are on the form. So I just want to point that out. It's we're all not perfect, we're all learning, and we're trying to get standard lists so that there's no confusion about what's approved and what isn't. Transfer and store is sort of a new area that we're going to work to clarify here in the next few months by changing the form and by adding specific products to it so you can pick for sharing and transfer, because transfer and share would be two different things. Transfer would mean that you're transferring the data to an outside entity. And again, it's only external transfer and share that we're worried about. We're not worried about if you, or you're not required to tell us or even fill out the form if you're transferring data internally to another department. It's when it's an external entity. And so transfer would be you're transferring the data to an external entity and they're going to have their own copy. They're going to change it. You're not going to have those changes. They're not going to send it back to you. But share would be like in a collaborative environment where or agreement where you have a couple other schools and you may have files in Dropbox or OneDrive or wherever it's approved to have it. And those people have access to the files and you work on them together. Or, share can also transfer. So they can also copy that file if it's allowed to their environment. So we're working through the requirements now of what's approved. I mean, they're kind of loose. That's why the form kind of addresses transfer more so than share right now. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out when you fill out a form if you have questions about that. This is what the certificate looks like if you don't know right now. So this is medium risk. It just kind of repeats back some of your answers so you have it as a record. You can always go back and look at your form. You will always have that if you go into Quality Build. It also tells you what the source is. It tells you what your data type is. So that's something that it classifies it for you and tells you what the variables you selected. So again, if something changes and you need to use a new variable, that's a change. And that may be a change in risk and you're going to have to modify the form because it might bump your risk up for your data use. It tells you what your approved storage plan was for that data. Again, it's just your record. So just a reminder, these are some of the things that have come up since October, that WVU and WVU Health Sciences and WV Medicine or WVU Health System are separate. So while you as a researcher may have dual roles that enable you to directly access the health system clinical data, the assumption should not be made that you can automatically use that for research purposes without any approvals. So, WVU Health System owns the data, all the clinical data coming from the hospital. WVCTSI is the data steward. They're the honest broker. It has to go through them for a privacy review and a release to the researcher for research access and use. Data oversight and compliance, which is where I am in the research office, we just facilitate all of that happening. And making sure that the data has correct storage. And again, we're not responsible for deciding what the storage is or making decisions on standards. It's just facilitating it so the research can be approved and moved through. Data management is the responsibility of the principal investigator. So a lot of it, we're trying to educate, give you all the tools that you need so that you know that you're in compliance. The not things have come up and are so confusing to talk about for data protection. So again, it's research data protection. We had to go through in a very detailed manner what things were not considered research. And then there are things that are research, but they're not human subjects research. So this became an issue with WVU Health System because research data should always be stored at a WVU on WVU storage, which would be health sciences for many of you or most of you. Data that is not research should be stored if you're at WVU medicine at WVU medicine. We should not be storing that from a legal liability purpose at health sciences, even if it involves the use of medical records for quality initiatives. And this is something that we've just recently completed the discussion about, and we haven't really communicated yet, but some of you I know have probably experienced getting stuck in the process because of this. So again, protocols are not required for things that are not research and things that are not human subjects research. Typically, people submit a protocol because they want to publish, and the publisher has a requirement for the determination letter that it is not human subjects research. The IRB does not require that you submit to them. It's purely optional. So these are the things that we have decided, and that's common. Again, according to the federal definition of research, that are not research, and these are the things that are research, but are not human subjects research. Both have optional protocol submissions. But they do require the data protection certificate if you are going to submit. So clinical trials, which I think is what most of you were interested in. Back when we started the form, I know the clinical trials got stuck. A lot of questions came up as to, well, how is the data getting to the sponsor? What other products are being used? Basically what's going on with technology for these studies. And then we took a look at the agreements, and the agreements were pretty generic about compliance, regulatory compliance. That's what it said. So, of course, HIPAA compliance and other applicable regulations. So for now, as most of you know, when you submit them, I've given most of you a kind of a pre-filled form to help you answer it until we get a better way to do it. And then I see them every day, and I send them for approval, and they're approved usually within a business day, unless again I'm out or something happens. The goal is for the sponsored ones is because the agreements were, so much time was taken for the agreements up front that we shouldn't have to go through the data protection process for those. So that's where we want to be. We have not had a chance to look at that yet. And I know Molly's going to talk a little more about that, but that's the process for now for the sponsored clinical trials. Investigator initiated have always had to go through the full process and still do today. So upcoming things that I've been working on are reorganizing the form flow for better content. So we're moving to more of a screen where, we're going to ask, is this a sponsored clinical trial? Is this, WVU medicine quality improvement? Because some of the stuff just gets moved out of the process and you don't finish the form because that's the way things are handled right now for those things. Hopefully it's a little more clear about data collection. So if it's, data collection versus using a medical record, I think the flow will be easier. And hopefully by June, we'll have that ready, and maybe some of you that we used to test the one before will help test the new one. Accommodate the policies for not research and NHSR. We can do some of that now, but we can't do all of it because of limitations with the current form. Address the data sharing and collaborative research situations because we don't do that right now. The sponsored clinical trials. Coordination of software and hardware approvals for PHI requests. So, if you're using, we've had requests recently for transcription software where there is PHI going into it, but it doesn't have a BAA. So trying to make sure those things, we front end those things and are proactive about it. I will be adding staff to assist the research community in filling out the forms and just consultations about data protection in general. We'll be offering some training and we hope to get to a point where we're auditing so we can get more stuff through faster and then rely on audits just to keep things in check and make sure we're doing what we should be doing. Our environments right now are extremely complex. They're disparate. it's hard to understand, I know, for a lot of you. And, you know, between all of us and the strategic plan and governance committees, I hope to get to a point where it's not as confusing, because I know probably for a lot of you it is today. And, you know, I'm thinking about monthly sessions to assist the research community, but I haven't gotten my feet under me enough to do that. So questions, and again, we have the vanity. I'll just say one thing before questions. This is the vanity account. It's part of my, it's on my screen every day. I do look at these things. I do talk to HSC, ITS, Lydia, and CTSI if I see things getting stuck. You know, when we move, it's not like it's going to Never Never Land and nobody looks. So you can feel free to reach out to me, and you can feel free to email the vanity account, which I encourage, because in the event that we do hire somebody, then there'll be a shared responsibility for that account. But you can always contact me if you have an issue or a deadline and something hasn't been approved. The content on the website is Google searchable, and this is the link directly to data protection. And if you need any help at all or want a consultation, you can contact me. Here's some related policies that, in addition to HIPAA and everything else that is on the regulatory side, these are the internal policies that we need to comply with. So that is it.
We did have a question in the room. I'm gonna give the mic to her.
Okay.
Hi, Rosemary, me again. I was wondering, so when the email is sent for the data protection certificate, is that email the only place where that certificate is located? And I say that because oftentimes within my unit, I feel like my faculty lose it. Email, and then we're both sitting there trying to figure out how to find it.
Where it is. It's sent to the submitter in their email box.
But is
and
there
really, no, I mean, it exists. You can, we can recreate it. Like I can get in and export one for you. It doesn't look as pretty. I can export the form, the certificate. I'd have to ask IT how we can. I know we've reproduced them, but right now that might be a little hard to do. But I can in a pinch export the contents of the form to you as a PDF. So it won't be the certificate, but I've done that for people who have lost them and they need to submit the protocol.
Sure. So it's not that you could go back to Quali Build and find it or something.
No, and the reason for that is Quali Build does not produce PDFs because Quali had this, philosophy that they wanted to support a paperless office, which, okay, I understand that, but sometimes you need a PDF and it does not produce them right now. So IT had to they had to go between another product from Microsoft to produce that form. So it's a really complex process, unfortunately, to produce that PDF. I'm hoping when we move to the new, we'll move to a new form, but then we will eventually move this to a new system and it won't be as bad. And you can have the option of having, your form online and you can easily go back, or your certificate. So there's the form that you fill out and then there's just the certificate, that's the result. The certificate has, it's just a little prettier and has more information about next steps. But right now it would be hard, I think, for you to go back and get that for you. But I can ask and follow up if you need me to.
Sort of my second question is, when I've tried to do this, and maybe I'm doing it wrong, go back into Quali Build to see what I've submitted. I don't think I'm that great at finding exactly what I submitted.
Okay. Meaning that you can't find it in Quali Build?
I can see that I did submit something, but I can't see authentically what selections I made. Is it in there and I'm just missing it?
Yeah, you should be able to click on the form and see what you submitted, the answers.
I'll try to do that again and then I'll touch base. Thank you.
And I can't see your name on the screen. If you tell me who it is, who you are, I can follow up with you.
Thank you.
And who is it?
I'll email you afterwards.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Because I can't see who's asking the question.
We did have a question. If we would be able to share the slides with the attendees.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. With that, I guess we'll go ahead and pass it to Molly. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you all.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending during your lunch hour. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the CTSI for inviting me to present. So I have been doing this. I'm on my 18th year of reviewing and negotiating clinical trial agreements for West Virginia University and previously for its research corporation. And I've worked with a lot of you through the years, and I really can't tell you how much I appreciate the collaboration. I promise, with that said, I know I'm dealing with a very educated audience, and we only have about 15 minutes left. So I have the presentation structured into segments, and I'm probably not going to get through the whole presentation. So probably just the first objective. And that is to provide a brief overview of the clinical trial agreement process from an Office of Sponsored Programs perspective. The second bullet point, which would be the terms and conditions contained in a clinical trial agreement. If there's enough time, I'll get through those. But if not, it's okay. I'm going to just focus on clinical trial agreements because I knew Rosemary was going to do an excellent job detailing the data protection process. And data use agreements, in my opinion, are straightforward. Once the investigator gets through the data protection process itself, OSP has templates that they can send out that are fillable, that we send out to our collaborators, and we can usually get an agreement in place fairly quickly because data use agreements are straightforward. I've been reviewing data use agreements for about 5 years now, and I think we've come a long way thanks to Rosemary and everybody at the institution coming together and collaborating. So that's why we decided just to focus on clinical trial agreements today. The first slide I have is a disclaimer, and attorneys love disclaimers, so I always include it. This is just a brief overview of the clinical trial agreement process. So it's intended for educational purposes only. It does not replace professional judgment. So if you have questions, you can always reach out to OSP and we'll work with you. We'll work through the questions. Disclaimers are complicated, and this slide is complicated because it kind of shows how we try to maintain consistency as we negotiate these agreements with industry and university standards. Like, we want to treat each agreement the same. However, we understand that each situation is unique, and risks and circumstances should be assessed according to study. So consistency, flexibility, sometimes it can be complicated, and that's where you come in, the research community. We're constantly seeking feedback from the clinical trial teams and the PIs. And I think if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be able to maintain this complex relationship with our sponsors. So thank you for that. It's been a great 18 years. The next slide, I'm going to start at the beginning. And as you know, all clinical trials usually start with a non-disclosure agreement, which are also called confidential non-disclosure agreements, depending on how the sponsor has it labeled. The sponsor requires that this agreement be in place before WVU has access to the protocol for review. So we certainly understand that they're time sensitive. And as such, in October of 2020, OSP became solely responsible for these type of CDAs and NDAs. And we have a one single point of contact. And I know a lot of you've probably worked with that person, but really anyone in the unit can take a look these types of agreements. And all clinical trial non-disclosure agreements, all non-disclosure agreements should be sent to this vanity account, cdaosp@mail.wvu.edu. And if you have any questions about that, please let somebody know. And you can certainly email this vanity account with questions about your non-disclosure agreements. Next. So how does OSP know to negotiate a clinical trial agreement? Like all things at OSP, a sponsored program's proposal summary sheet is submitted through the KC system. And this was formerly called the Blue Sheet for people who've been here at the institution as long as I have. Each KC submission should contain the approved budget. OSP won't start the clinical trial negotiation process until we're fairly confident we have a final budget for the study. We also need an initial draft of the clinical trial agreement and the copy of the protocol document just for reference in case there's questions. A big question that we get at OSP all the time is, do I need a KC submission for a budget amendment? Currently, the answer is no. The only time you would need a KC submission for an amendment to a clinical trial is if the sponsor or the PI changes. But at this point, it's not needed for a budget amendment. But as always, please reach out and we'll be in touch with you if there's any questions about that. The next is, I want to talk a little bit about consistency. And the reason I chose this topic is I know a lot of our clinical trial community wonders, one agreement went through quickly, one agreement did not. Why is this happening? So that's why I wanted to focus on consistency today. OSP maintains consistency with terms that are preferred by institutions of higher education as they enter into the clinical trial process. And the way we do this is we follow what we call the industry standard. And the two, what I consider Bibles for the industry standard for institutions of higher education, is the MAGI model clinical trial agreement and what we call the accelerated clinical trial agreement, also known as the ACTA. These documents are public available, and I love them because they're annotated, meaning there's different variations on a single term and justification for the reasons that each of these terms are included as part of like the industry standard. Like I said, they're publicly available. MAGI is called Model Agreement and Guidelines International, and it's an organization dedicated to best practices for clinical operations. So if you just Google it, it'll pop right up, but I'm happy to provide a copy if anyone's interested. And the ACTA is a publication of the University Industry Partnership for facilitating relationships with industries who are interested in expediting the contract process for institutions of higher education. So that's kind of how we maintain consistency across the board. And I know I only have 9 minutes, so I'm hurrying. I promise I won't keep you any longer. OSP maintains consistencies among its negotiators within the office by using a standardized checklist. And I wasn't going to create a slide because it would probably be Greek to the community, but I'm happy to review it with anyone who's interested. It's about 5 pages long. It's fairly detailed. It really acts as an outline of the terms and conditions that we see in each clinical trial that we review. And our group, right now we have 9 negotiators, and we'll be back down to 7 shortly. And we have 2 law students that we work with who are wonderful, but each reviewer or negotiator will get this checklist, review the agreement, dot I's, cross T's, check off. Anything that's a deviation from our checklist, we get together as a group, we meet with weekly, and we discuss these deviations. and how, as an institution, we think we should proceed. Sometimes a clinical team or principal investigator will say, you're asking me these same questions over and over. And the reason we do that is your feedback is so important to us. And we realize that circumstances change with each study during different periods in time. So we just need to check back in and make sure we're hitting everything that's important on this checklist and for you as a researcher. So that's why the clinical team and the principal investigator are extremely important to the clinical trial process. The clinical trial negotiation process, excuse me. So that is how we made consistency within OSP. Among the university, I love this slide because this, in the last minutes of my presentation, kind of encapsulates all our important partners as we go through and we negotiate a clinical trial agreement. Each one of these organizations or offices could have a presentation unto themselves because they're so integral to the process. I'm just going to briefly talk about OSP's relationship with each of these offices as we move through the negotiation process. And the first is the Board of Risk Management, which we reach out to the Risk Management Office, who is the broker for BRIM. And so to make sure each time the insurance clause is included in a clinical trial agreement, that it meets the expectations of our broker. We have pretty standard insurance language that we see and include in agreements, which is later on in this slide deck. I don't think I'm going to get to it today, but anytime we see a deviation in the language, we reach out to our risk manager, who's a wonderful person. I don't think she's on the presentation today or watching the presentation today, but anytime we're uncomfortable with language, we reach out to that office and they assure us we have the coverage we need to continue with the trial. The second office is the Center of Excellence in Clinical Trials. They also help us assess liability and risk. And the way that process works is once the indemnification, subject injury, insurance, anything that deals with liability and risk, once we have come to a consensus with the sponsor and the institution, we send the clinical trial agreement off to the Center of Excellence in Clinical Trials. They apprise the whole situation, and then the study is able to move forward. So we work very closely with that center to make sure liability and risk are being covered. The Office of General Counsel is integral. They don't review each clinical trial agreement, only special ones. They have what we call questions of law that we, OSP, are not able to consent to because we are not legal. We are a financial office. So the only real legal office at WVU is the Office of General Counsel. So all questions of law are forwarded onto them. The Office of Human Subjects Protection assists with all non-standard terms. I can't tell you, Gretchen, I know you're on. Thank you so much for all your help. If I see something that looks unusual, I reach out to that office to make sure we're not promising anything that the institution can't consent to. The same with the Office of Information Technology. They assist us with non-standard data protection terms and data security terms. Generally, we know what we can agree to in a clinical trial agreement. It's all the big ones, HIPAA, High-Tech, Privacy Act. But anything that's unusual or non-standard, we'll reach out to the Office of Information Technology, and they'll tell us whether or not we can be in compliance with the terms of the agreement. The Office of Technology Transfer, wonderful with helping ownership and licensing of intellectual property. We certainly understand this is sponsor's drug, this is sponsor's protocol. We really don't have the ability to own or create any intellectual property as a result of participating in the study. However, if sponsor wants to own something that's not directly related to the study drug or the protocol, it's somewhat overreaching. And again, I can talk about this more, but I don't think I'm going to get to do it today. we need to reach out to tech transfer to make sure we're not overstepping what we can and can't convey to the sponsor as a result of participating in the study. University Hospital and University Health Associates are also wonderful. And that is also a complicated relationship. They probably deserve their own presentation also. Anytime the study personnel or facilities of a third party that's going to be used to perform the study is referenced in the contract, I know the negotiator will reach out to the clinical team and say, are you using the facilities of anyone other than WVU or study personnel that may or may not be WVU employees? Depending on the answer, we'll need to coordinate the contracting efforts with the University Hospital system and University Health Associates. Device studies are particularly complicated because you're usually inserting something into a patient. We know it's probably going to take place at the hospital, so we always loop the hospital into the process. And sometimes that takes a little bit of extra time, not because of the hospital, but because we have to make the sponsor understand that, like most institutions with a clinical component, the hospital is a separate legal entity. So it requires a little bit more coordination in that regard. And like Rosemary highlighted, data is a big issue too. All data comes from the hospital, depending on how the agreement reads or where the data is going or how the data is being collected. We need to loop the hospital in to make sure all our bases are covered from a contractual point of view. So my next slide gets into the nitty gritty of the terms and conditions of the agreement. But since we're at the 1 p.m. hour, I think I'm going to end it there, Debbie and Carrie, if you don't mind, just so people can go to lunch and all that fun stuff, go to their next meeting.
Well, with that, I just want to thank Molly and Rosemary both for presenting today. Molly, am I able to send out your slides as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you guys, anybody attending, that I'll go ahead and send slides and sign-in sheets after today. And it was also recorded, so it will be on our CTSI YouTube channel. So thank you everybody for attending today, and have a great weekend.